When After Effects imports footage, it has to make some guesses about certain characteristics of the footage. If it guesses wrong, you can make corrections using the Interpret Footage dialog box. Let's see how this is done. I'll select the Hip Hop Girl image sequence footage item here, and choose File, Interpret Footage, Main. And here we can see information about a few aspects of footage that After Effects has to make guesses on, but that you might need to correct. Let's begin with the alpha channel. If we tell it to ignore the alpha channel, we notice that in the composition panel, the preview shows us what will happen. But we do actually have an alpha channel, so we don't want to ignore it. Straight is what After Effects guessed on its own, but if this is wrong, we can tell it to choose pre-multiplied, matted with color. Now notice when I choose this and have pre-multiplied with black chosen, there's a white halo in the semi-transparent areas. If I change this to pure white, so that we say that it's matted with white, then we get a black halo. And that's because this wasn't actually matted with a color at all. So straight was the right guess. So After Effects got that right, so we'll leave it as it is. Because this is an image sequence, and image sequences don't have intrinsic frame rate, After Effects is simply going with its default, which is 30 frames per second. But if I happen to know that this was actually shot at 23.976 frames per second, I can enter that here. We can choose a start timecode other than 0. And in cases where there's interlacing, we can choose to separate fields, and whether we separate fields interpreting as the upper field coming first or the lower field coming first. This is an image sequence, so it's not interlaced. If After Effects were to see that the item that we brought in had the frame dimensions of standard definition DV footage, it would make the correct choice here because it knows the field order of standard definition DV footage. This can be a bit of a trick sometimes, though, because if you bring in a footage item that does not have interlacing, but it does have the same frame dimensions as standard definition DV footage, After Effects might guess wrong and separate fields for you. We also have pixel aspect ratio here. These days, many things are shot with square pixels, including high-definition television, but many pixels are not square. If After Effects gets this wrong, you can just make the explicit assignment here. And also in the footage interpretation, you can choose how many times a footage item is to loop. Let's cancel out of this by closing the Interpret Footage dialog box. So we see here that we have 30 frames per second for this footage item. And for the next footage item, we have 23.976 frames per second. If we want to apply the interpretation settings from one footage item to another, we can select the item, choose File, Interpret Footage, Remember Interpretation, choose another item, go to File, Interpret Footage, Apply Interpretation, and then note that this item here now has 23.976 as its frame rate instead of 30, matching the one that we copied the settings from here. If you need to change the rules that After Effects is using to make its automatic footage interpretations, you can do so in the Interpretation Rules file. To find the Interpretation Rules file, go to Edit, Preferences, General, and click Reveal Preferences in Explorer, or on macOS, this would say Reveal Preferences in Finder. And the folder that contains the Preferences files opens. Also in the Preferences folder is the Interpretation Rules file. If you open this, you'll see that it has a lot of explanation about its rules. And then it has rules that are written in a very specific syntax for how to interpret certain kinds of items. For example, if it sees an item with 720 pixels by 576 pixels, then it will assume that that item should have a frame rate of 25 frames per second, because that matches standard definition PAL. You don't need to understand all of these rules and the syntax just now. Just know that if you do need to tell After Effects how to change its rules, this is the file in which you do it. And you can read the instructions here. I'll close this and click Cancel. After Effects usually guesses correctly when it's interpreting footage, but if it guesses wrong, you can correct it either through the Interpret Footage dialog box or through the Interpretation Rules file.